Thank you for joining me for this presentation about internal controls in times of crisis. My name is Bethany Verbal, and I'm a manager in the audit department at Costerisan. As you've probably heard 100 times over the past couple of weeks, we are in unprecedented times. We're all figuring out a new, albeit temporary, normal, and one thing that can get set aside during times of crisis are internal controls. It's easy to think that they don't matter during times like this, but internal controls are just as, if not more important, to have during times of crisis. That said, a lot of internal controls rely on having more than one person involved or present during a process, which can be tough to do during times of social distancing. So, we've come up with a variety of different ways to help you maintain internal controls while still maintaining social distancing and protecting you and your staff. Before we get into any specifics, I would say that overall, now is a great time to make sure that you're utilizing your accounting software to its fullest. If there are approvals that can be done electronically through the system, or dual-level controls that can be set up for journal entries, now would be a great time to explore those options and see if those make sense for your organization. Communication and documentation is always important, but those are vital elements to keep an organization running smoothly during this time. Let's start with the receipting process. Nonprofits and religious organizations tend to receive a number of physical checks for payment, so let's talk about some ways to handle these. Remember, essential business services are still allowed to continue under the Stay Safe, Stay Home executive order, so most organizations still have someone going in and opening the mail. What that also means, though, is that any payments received in the mail are being handled by one person. As we all know, having just one person involved isn't ideal when it comes to internal controls, so there are a number of options to help mitigate the risk here. One option would be to have a video conference while the person is opening the mail, stamping for deposit only on the checks received, and filling out the deposit slip. That way, there are two people at least visually present with the payments. Once the checks have been stamped for deposit only, the risk of the checks not being deposited to the appropriate account is greatly reduced. So then the person opening the mail could take the deposit to the bank. That said, another great option would be to use a check scanner, and this is something that most financial institutions offer. This way, while you're on the video conference, the person opening the mail would scan all of the checks while the other person is on the video call, and then the deposit is simply made while everyone is there. Most video conferencing services, like Zoom or Microsoft Teams, allow you to record, which provides a great record of the process and the controls. I would also recommend, whether you decide to have a video conference or not, have the person opening the mail make an initial listing of checks received. This listing would include the payer, the amount of the payment, the check number, and the purpose of the payment, presuming that the payer included that information. I'd recommend making that list a shared document, either on your server, through Google Docs, or through Teams. This way, there's a listing of payments received that everyone has access to. This listing can also be used, as we'll discuss later, during the bank reconciliation process to compare to the deposits made. Now, this next idea, it might be something new for your organization, but I would highly recommend having an online giving option. Everyone wants to help out during this time when we're all being told to stay home. So offering an online giving option is a great way to allow people to contribute to your organization while they're streaming Netflix from home. Additionally, because payments come directly to your bank account, this reduces some of the internal control risks that come along with receiving physical checks and making deposits. There are a lot of online giving options out there, and many of them are offering discounts or assistance in implementation given the current situation. So it might be a great time to explore that option for your organization. Now, I will say, given that we're practicing social distancing, it's not likely, but there are still some organizations that are receiving cash. Given that it's so liquid, it tends to be the riskiest type of payment received. So again, I would recommend a video conference while one person is counting the cash to ensure that there's another person visually present. while on the video conference, the person counting should fill out the deposit slip and include the cash payment in that initial listing. That way, once the deposit is made, there's good documentation of how much should have been deposited, which again can be used during the bank reconciliation process. And as a last idea, utilizing a lockbox service from your bank may also be a great option. Payments can be sent directly to the lockbox address, and payments are retrieved and deposited to your account by bank staff without you or your staff having to be involved. So now that we've talked about getting money in, let's talk about money going out for general disbursements. So if your organization mails out physical checks, typically one person will get the invoices in the mail, give those to the accounting staff who enters the information in the accounting system, and then they give the invoices to the check signer. The check signer reviews the invoices, documents their approval, and signs the check. Someone else, maybe the person that initially opened the mail, would then mail the checks. Now, I see a system like this still working, but maybe with some modifications. The person opening the mail would still open the invoices. Instead, though, of putting the invoices in someone's mailbox, those invoices could be scanned and either emailed or put in a shared location. Those transactions would then be entered by the designated person. Once entered, the invoices would be given to the check signer, who could do a blanket approval of the invoices over email. That email would be saved with the batch of invoices and indicate that the invoices were reviewed and approved. So now that we have our invoices entered and processed and approved, how do we print the checks? I think you have a number of options here. One would be to have the person entering the information still go into the office, coordinating time so that they're not there with other staff to print the checks. These could be left at the office for the check signer to come by and sign. Not perhaps the fastest system, but effective in maintaining controls while still maintaining social distancing. Another option, depending on where you store check stock and who has access, would be to have the accountant enter the payment information, and then once that's ready and the invoices have been approved, have the person that's in the office opening mail put check stocks in the printer and print the checks. The check signer could then come by and sign the checks. Again, these options are not necessarily going to be as quick as they might be during a quote-unquote normal time, but it allows you to maintain internal controls while still protecting staff. If your organization utilizes electronic payments, this might be a great time to expand that usage. Many financial institutions allow for dual controls. So one person, likely the accountant, enters the transaction, but then the check signer has to release the payment in the banking website. This is a great option for push transactions. For any transactions that are pull, so the vendor pulls the payment directly from your account, just like during your normal operating procedures, it's still important for invoices for those transactions to be reviewed and approved. Bill.com is also another great option to utilize that allows you to pay bills electronically, again, while still maintaining internal controls through review and approval. Especially with things like Bill.com, you may actually find that some of the processes that you begin using during this time end up becoming a permanent process for your organization. Another option for disbursements would be to use credit cards. Now, I have mixed feelings about credit cards because there's definitely a risk of someone being able to make unauthorized purchases and you wouldn't know about it for about a month. That said, right now, credit cards offer a way for someone to make more immediate payments, as well as helping your organization out with cash flow. If you put a payment on a credit card, you typically have at least a few weeks before that statement comes in and has to be paid. So it gives you some leeway in having the cash to pay that bill. If this is something that your organization chooses to do, it's still very important to maintain controls and documentation. Any purchases that are put on a credit card must have related detailed documentation, and the business purpose of that transaction needs to be included. These receipts and invoices that were paid on the credit card could be scanned and either, again, emailed to the approver or put in a shared file so both parties have access. So we've brought in funds and we've sent out funds to vendors, but there are also considerations to make surrounding payroll. Now for your organization, this might be something that's done via a third party or entirely electronically already, in which case you'll likely follow the processes already in place. If you still have elements that aren't electronic though, we do have some suggestions. So hourly employees, if they fill out physical time cards, would still fill those out and could scan and email those to their supervisor. The supervisor would still review and approve the time card, but that documentation would likely be an email approval or, again, utilizing a shared file. Once the information has been approved, that would be given to the accountant to enter into the payroll system. Any payroll reports that are reviewed during a more normal time would still be reviewed, but just done electronically. The biggest thing I would say here is to make sure that you're still following a solid review process and maintaining the documentation of that review. So if you choose to use email as the review and approval process, make sure that you're saving those emails in a file so that you have the documentation that things were reviewed and approved. It's also important to remember that there has been a lot of legislation that has come out recently that deals with things like sick leave and unemployment during this time. Mainer has a lot of content, both currently available and coming out, that will help you wade through all the requirements. From an internal controls perspective, the biggest thing is to make sure that you're documenting how you're handling all of these things and maintaining that documentation. The items that we've talked about already tend to be the big transaction classes for organizations, but there are certainly other considerations. For example, the bank reconciliation process. If one of the check signers typically receives the bank statement unopened, this can be tough to do if that person isn't coming into the office. This would be a great time to have your financial institution give that person read-only access to the bank account. That person can review the bank information online and then let the reconciler know that they reviewed the activity and the account can be reconciled. Most bank reconciliations are done electronically, so that reconciliation will be done as usual, but then it could be sent to the reviewer and that person can indicate their approval via email or, again, a shared document. I would also say, as a general best practice, but especially during a time like this where controls are being modified, review of canceled checks and banking transactions on a frequent basis is a great way to look out for unusual or unauthorized transactions. So it might be something that you typically do during a month-end reconciliation process, but I would recommend doing it more frequently during this time, again, just so you have a good idea of what's coming in and going out of your accounts. Though this certainly isn't a comprehensive list, hopefully this has provided you some guidance on best practices about internal controls in a time of crisis. The biggest thing I think you need to remember is that it's all about communication. You want to have the documentation of approvals and transactions, and a lot of that can be accomplished by open and frequent communication between all the parties involved. Socially, as we all know, we need to be distanced during this time, but there are so many communication methods available that we can really stay in touch and keep our organizations running and providing vital services. If you have specific questions about transactions or how to implement some of the electronic methods we've talked about, please reach out to us at Mainer Costerisan. My contact information is on the slide. We're here to help as we all navigate this temporary normal. So thank you very much for tuning in and have a great day.